Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Bakari Lumumba, the progenitor of lumumbaspeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Back with another video, but before we start, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button and share this video with all your friends and well-wishers. So we're back with another video, part 2 of our groundbreaking series, Combating the Carceral State. We're looking at how did we get here, right? So we're going to examine how did we get into a situation of mass incarceration? How are we in a situation in which America, the most industrialized, and even in some aspects by some social scientists, they see America as the most over-industrialized nation, a developed nation in the world, leading the nation in terms of incarceration rate. So we're going to take a look at that and look at how the issue of how criminality went from being something that was seen as rooted in rightness to becoming a metonym for, of course, Blackness. So we're going to get started. First and foremost, I would like to state when we're talking about combating the carceral state, we talk about mass incarceration, and we know that when we're talking about the carceral state, we're talking about this idea, the ideology, the values, and the logic of society that believes that incarceration is what is most important in terms of how to solve the problem of crime in society, right? But we know many scholars argue that incarceration and the penal system is seen as a solution to social, political, and economic problems. And we're going to get into that a little bit. So I want to start off by saying nothing succeeds like failure. But I think it's important to acknowledge that failure is in the eye of the beholder. And why am I saying that? That's a quote that I got from a book that I read while I was an undergraduate student at Wright State University. And the title of the book is The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison. And the analogy or the argument that they're making when they say nothing succeeds like failure, but failure is in the eye of the beholder. Because for many people, logical people, lay people, they would think that if the crime rate continues to be high, that's a failure on the side of policing and the criminal justice system. However, for many in the power elite, according to C. Wright Mills, that's not the case, right? Because the crime has developed a cottage industry in the criminal justice system to where it is nearly a $200 billion a year industry, right? So we're talking about judges, lawyers, DAs, bailiffs, stenographers, COs, so on and so forth, probation officers, right? Transportation. So there's a lot that goes into the criminal justice system. And so what they're arguing in their book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, please make sure you get a copy of this if you don't already have it. They're talking about that this is done purposely, and the reason why is because it makes money for a lot of people. This reminds me of Michael Moore. In his book, he had a documentary on the city of Flint, and they talked about that after the last GM plant shut down, crime went up as a result of people not being able to make them the type of money and afford the type of living that they had before. And so what ended up taking place was they built a new prison, and all the rich people came and threw a party and spent a night in the prison to celebrate the prison being built. Can you imagine that, right? So this is what we're seeing, that this is an issue of class as well as race and ideology and political issues as well. But I think it's also important that when we talk about the carceral state, we have to understand that according to our warrior scholar, Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, she talks about that African Americans, particularly African Americans, have been under a system of social control since we, of course, came here to America. Unfortunately, over 400, 500 years ago. And what she argues is that, the system of social control started with chattel enslavement, then it moved to sharecropping, Black Crows, convict leasing, Jim Crow, and now, of course, the new Jim Crow. And that under the system of social control, it was all rooted in controlling the Black body, and how can we use the Black body to, unfortunately, not only deny it certain citizenship rights, but oftentimes it was about how can we make money off of them as well. And this is something that goes back to this issue of what we talk about anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism, or Orlando Patterson's concept of social death, to where the Black body, even years after the end of chattel enslavement, even though years at the end of the transatlantic slave trade, is still seen as something that is considered a commodity to be bought and sold and traded on the world market. So that's an issue for another day that we'll probably get into. We're talking about combating the carceral state. How did we get here? So when we talk about how we got here, many people are always complaining about what's the importance of knowing history, right? Why do we need to learn history? When we go to they schools, not our schools, but they schools, they would oftentimes argue that we're learning their history, not our own. And so I think it's very important that when we begin this section, talking about how did we get here, that we start this section with an African proverb. And that proverb is, if you know your beginning well, your end will not trouble you, right? So in the spirit of Sankofa, we understand that historically, we go back 100 years, back during the Prohibition era, back during the era of public enemies, right? We know the FBI will put out their public enemy list 1 through 10. Nowadays it's seen as what America's most wanted, FBI's top most wanted fugitive. But when we look at the public enemy list, there were individuals such as Al Capone, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and we're not talking about Mayweather, right? But the Babyface Nelson, of course, and even Bonnie and Clyde. All of these individuals at one point we consider public enemy number one, but also illuminates an issue that is rooted in what? That the face of criminality 100 years ago in America was white, a white face, rooted in whiteness. So also, if you ever get a chance, and this is almost a side note, but there's a book by a strong warrior sister, a warrior scholar, Dr. Keisha Blaine. She's a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. She wrote a book called Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women in the Global Struggle for Freedom. And in this book, she talked about the prominent black women in the struggle, in the Pan-African and Black national struggle, particularly after Garvey was deported to Jamaica. You know, oftentimes, unfortunately, we study the history of black resistance movements. Black women typically are not illuminated in those conversations or in those studies. But she does that in this text, in this book. But one of the things that she talks about, and you don't have this book, make sure you go out and get it, Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women in the Global Struggle for Freedom. She talks about that there was a belief, a cultural ethos in the black community in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and I would dare say even 50s, that we did not engage in criminal behavior because we view criminality as being rooted in what? Whiteness. That being a criminal was acting white. And they talked about the history, of course, of enslavement, right? But they talked about the genocide of Native Americans, the stealing of their lands, right? The genocidal suppression of the Filipino resistance movements doing after the American-Spanish War, right? So they talked about this history of black people engaging in criminal activity, and as a result, they associated criminal activity with being white. And I would dare say, I wish that we felt that way today, right? And so as a result, the face and the individuals who propagated in large number propagated in large number the penal institutions, we're talking about prison, probation, and parole, were what? White men. Now, however, that's changed. So when we talk about how did we get here? Well, the 1970s, you know, the Nixon administration put in what? This concept and idea of law and order, right, to suppress the civil rights movement. And as a result, what ended up taking place? We have a situation now in which black people, for numerous reasons, particularly, of course, the Reagan era and the crack epidemic, and we will talk about that in the part 3, about how do we move forward. Black people are now the most, the highest percentage of people in the penal system. We're talking about prison, probation, or parole, encompassing the carceral state. So I think it's very important. And why is that the case, right? I would argue there's a number of issues. I think it came at the confluence of 3 things: the breakdown of the traditional black family, integration, and of course the liberalization of black values. And when I talk about the liberalization of black values, there was a time in the black community that if you were arrested, you shamed your family, right? You rather them take you to jail than take you home to your parents, because it was going to be hell on high water. It was going to be murder, she wrote, and we're not talking about Angela Lansbury, right? And so that's changed. I can even recall growing up, my father would always tell my brother and I, if you get arrested, don't call here, we're not paying your bill. And we'll look at our mother, and my mother said, what you looking at me for? You heard what he said. And so I think we've lost that cultural ethos, right? Most importantly, not viewing criminality as whiteness, but almost it's gotten to the point where it's become synonymous as blackness. I remember reading an article where there were black men stating that going to jail or going to prison is a rite of passage to manhood. That is completely asinine, right? Asinine, after 10, after 11. And so we have to get back to some of the things that work for us, right? We understand and know that, as Nino Brown said in New Jack City, we don't manufacture any Uzis, right? Ain't no poppy fields in Harlem, right? But the reality of the situation is we have to have the wherewithal, the fortitude and the temerity to resist the nefarious aspects of society that, of course, the dominant side is trying to put on us to keep us in a condition where we're not made to survive. because we have to be self-determined. We have to use our kuchakalia self-determination, of course our kuumba creativity, to find other ways to make a living, and not turn to hitting a lick or engaging in criminal activity to make a living simply because we've fallen on hard times financially. So that's how we got here. Like I said, this was just part 2 of our series on combating the carceral state. And so just want to kind of touch on how did we get to a situation in which 100 years ago the face of criminality were white men, but nowadays it's shifted to black men and even black women, because we know black women have the highest rate of incarceration nowadays, the highest growing rate of incarceration. And so I think part of that is twofold. We know anytime we're dealing with an issue in our community, not just the black community in America, but globally, we have an external enemy, but of course, white supremacy, anti-black racism, and then we have an internal enemy, and that's the racially disempowering, self-defeating, and self-destructive ways that we live our daily lives. So that's all I have for now. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Until next time, peace.